Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Shot. I'm Joe Dyer, back on Gadigal country, and very pleased to be rejoining you for this fantastic episode where we are joined as ever by my co-host, Dave Milner.
G'day, Joe. Great to have you back.
Thank you very much.
I'm spinning out.
It's good to be back, and it's great to be joined by some great guests again. Returning to the panel of the Sunday Shot is a favourite of ours, Scott Burchill. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, and good to be with you again.
You've also been on an overseas trip, and we'll hear a little bit about that. And making her debut as a panellist, but already a friend of the Sunday Shot from her appearances in interviews, great interviews with Dave, is Sarah Schwartz from the Jewish Council of Australia. Sarah, hi.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us today. We are going to spend most of the show talking about the ceasefire in Gaza, how it's holding, what it's looking like on the ground, what the next steps are likely to be. But before we do, just a quick wrap-up of the domestic politics of the week. Prime Minister Albanese flew off on a short holiday, apparently to a Micronesian nation, I've heard, and apparently flying economy so that no one could level any criticism against him whatsoever about exploiting any relationships with the flying kangaroo. But in his absence, his treasurer was forced to announce the back down on his signature super policies. Eat Paul Keating's proverbial shit sandwich in Albanese's absence. The two key elements of the policy, Scott, that had attracted criticism, mostly from organisations like the Financial Review, were that there was going to be tax on unrealised assets, and the threshold was not indexed. Hadn't been that much controversy about it recently, and certainly was never raised as an issue in the election campaign. And yet it appears that Albanese was afraid that they would become those policy barnacles that John Howard spoke of, and he's ditched them. Couldn't even spend a little bit of political capital on those two relatively minor changes.
Well, this is a very cautious government. They don't like any controversy, and they don't want any difficult policy cells. So given they hadn't really presented it very well, in fact, they really didn't. They really fumbled the presentation and justification and the clarification of the policy. It was never clear to anyone exactly why this was necessary. And of course, it probably wasn't. There's much more money to be made by governments clamping down on tax avoidance. But that's even more difficult for governments to do, apparently. So in the end, Albanese cut Chalmers loose and said it was just not worth the negative press. And remember, the negative press that he's talking about is, as you say, the Australian Financial Review, the Murdoch press. But a government which won such a commanding victory only recently, as you said, has a lot of political capital to spend, and they decided it wasn't worth spending any of it. So they've dumped it.
It seems ridiculous. Apparently, some of the criticism was fueling anxiety within Cabinet that there would be a broader political campaign about taxing wealth.
Well, that reminds them of the super tax in mining. I think that's what is a reference to there, because the numbers we're talking about are minuscule.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of taxpayers and superannuants are just not affected in any way. So they were not prepared to alienate even those at the top end of the income spectrum.
If they're worried about that, they should be worried about that, because that is unequivocally what's coming their way. They are refusing. Our middle class is being hollowed out. Our economy is getting worse. They're not suggesting anything that will fix it. That type of campaign is coming. And we're talking about the Labor Party. Do they feel like getting on board with it?
Well, I think that's the thing, is that a Labor Party is simply unable to counter arguments about why levying taxes on the wealthiest people of all is actually a reasonable and equitable thing to do, if they're not able to make that argument, then, they're not really a party for the labourers and for Labor anymore. And apparently part of this was fuelled, Sarah, by a fear of the scrutiny that was being levied by Tim Wilson and his return to Parliament. And you think, wow, if he's now a bogeyman in terms of communication strategy of the opposition, Labor's, they've got a few problems.
I mean, and who are they talking, who are they representing in this moment? And as Scott said, what are they doing with their landslide victory? If we continue to see the Labor Party failing to take critical action that affects people's bottom lines, we're going to see more and more people who are disgruntled and upset. And I think, we can only look to the March for Australia rallies, which are happening again this weekend, which of course have neo-Nazi infiltration and far-right infiltration and all the rest and organisation. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that are turning to the far right because this government is failing to meet people's bottom lines.
So the other point I think is worth making is that if you don't make these sorts of changes in the very first year of your new term, you're never going to make any significant policy initiatives, because this is where you can wear them for a while before you have to go back to the people. So that's the first point. The second point is I live in Tim Wilson's electorate, and he scraped in. I mean, he just scraped in against a Teal. So his political security, I think, is highly unbalanced at this point. And if they had any political strategy for the next election yet, they'd be targeting, preferencing another strong independent, perhaps Zoe Daniel again, to win that seat back, because he only really won it on a recount in a very narrow victory. Not that you'd know it from the statements that he's made, but if you think he's the future of the Liberal Party, they've got real trouble.
Yeah, I don't think Zoe Daniel's done yet. Whether or not she's going to run again in Gosdarn, I don't know. But I think his politics is now running hot in her blood. Let's put it that way. Dave.
Chris Hedges and I spoke about this earlier today. We're going to go to that later in the show. But across the Western world, we are seeing parties that are meant to represent the working classes, and I'm talking about the Labor Party in the UK, the Australian Labor Party, and the Democrats, not doing that whatsoever. And the historic pattern is that when you meet white supremacy and encroaching fascism with meek centrism that doesn't actually address these economic concerns, that is how a society slides into Nazism and fascism. So this is serious stuff that we are not taking seriously.
It is. And look, the irony, just to finish on the super changes, was that, these thresholds of 3 million and now the new one of 10 million that has been introduced are now going to be indexed. Yet the modest boost to the low-income superannuation tax offset, which ensures low-income workers don't pay a higher tax on their super contribution, is not going to be indexed. So yet again, you see an asymmetry there.
Well, it's like negative gearing. They have easy ways of limiting the number of properties that one individual can negatively gear without having any significant impact on the housing market. They could limit it to 3, for example, and that would be a significant measure, but they're just not up for the fight. They're not up to put the arguments in front of the public. So they squib them and nothing gets changed.
Yes. And the government seems very keen to sort of tinker around the edges and, do things like allow people to draw from their super or, have a 5% deposit, things which, are only driving up prices for housing whilst actually not addressing those real structural issues that are the reason we have such an unequal housing market and why so many people are being locked out.
So another fight that the government doesn't seem up for is around the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So Murray Watts is intending to introduce his legislation into Parliament when it resumes. And actually, he's announced that he wants to introduce it before Parliament rises, but he is saying to different groups that he actually wants to pass it before Parliament rises on November 27, despite no one actually having seen the draft legislation as yet. The two things that we do know is that he ditched the climate trigger that would make decision makers factor in a project's emissions during the assessment process, because, of course, we all know that the climate has absolutely no impact on the environment. And the other thing that we know is that he is gearing up to negotiate with the coalition on the passing of the legislation and to snub the Greens entirely. And we know this because he's apparently asking the mining lobby, the mining companies, to lobby the opposition to get them to support it, because he thinks that which can only suggest that he thinks that the mining companies will benefit from the passing of these reforms, because it will streamline the approval processes for them. So, yeah, environment brought to you by the opposition and the miners. Perhaps not what we were hoping for with this reform. And finally, this week in the Supreme Court, the New South Wales Supreme Court has struck down the law that had given the police expanded powers to prevent protests near places of worship. New South Wales government had apparently been warned that this was likely to happen by members of their own caucus, that it has been found to be unconstitutional because it encroaches on the implied freedom of political communication. So, Sarah, these were the laws they happened around the country as a response from state governments to purported rise in anti-Semitism after October 7. And really did seem to a lot of people, and now the Supreme Court, to be overreach in what the police and the state was able to close down in the name of anti-Semitism and social cohesion.
I mean, this sort of reflects this broader problem that I think we've seen throughout, particularly in the last 2 years, but not unique to the last 2 years, where acts of anti-Semitism, and of course, Chris Minns was responding as well to the Dural caravan hoax and actions which we know were not actually, didn't have anything to do with protest, and potentially not even, motivated by anti-Semitism in terms of the Dural caravan hoax. But what we've seen is that again and again, acts of anti-Semitism are responded to through the implementation of anti-democratic measures. And we see this hugely in the US, and we saw, and we've seen Albanese and other Labor governments, again, using Jewish people and acts of anti-Semitism as, I would say, like kind of a scapegoat to push anti-democratic measures in the form of anti-protest laws, in the form of calling universities up before inquiries, pushing for definitions of anti-Semitism that capture criticism of Israel. And we only have to look to America to see how destructive that is, where in the name of Jewish people, Trump is dismantling the entire system of American higher education, the media system, every single public institution in the name of Jewish safety. And it's of course not good for our democracy for this to happen, but I would also say it's very bad for Jewish people. It's never a good thing when Jewish people are used by elites to push their own interests. That is what we know historically. And I think in this moment, to have Jewish people continually associated with anti-democratic measures that I think the vast majority of the population can see as anti-democratic, I don't think that's very good for Jewish people. I think it's actually something that breeds anti-Semitism. And we've seen that it breeds anti-Semitism.
Julian Segal's entire role seems centered around exactly what you're talking about, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we warned the government at the time that Gillian Segal was appointed, that instead of appointing someone who has a genuine expertise in anti-racism, for example, or genuine expertise in anti-Semitism even, the government appointed someone with a long history of lobbying for Israel against anti-war protesters, against Palestinian voices in particular, and then has someone that has now put forward a report which is predominantly about quashing criticism of Israel, really. I mean, attacks on the question of monitoring of the media for bias, attacks on universities, on the arts, like these conversations have all occurred in the context of people speaking up on Palestine in those industries. And so all these sorts of measures that she wants to take in those sectors really have to do with silencing criticism of Israel. But what we can see, and I think what we see in the US, but also what we're seeing here, is this goes far beyond Israel. If we have sort of someone monitoring our media for bias that has an explicit bias towards Israel, if we have someone, saying that university funding can be cut, that creative arts funding can be cut, we will see the devaluation of all of these public institutions. And this is really, I would say, just, Israel and anti-Semitism are just, the catalyst for a broader breakdown in those public institutions if our government adopts them. Now, I don't think that the government will adopt all of the recommendations in that report. I actually think they've kind of got egg on their face in this moment, and that they're probably trying to figure out what the best way is to move away from it.
Oh, yeah, Tony Burke was well and truly dodging the questions about the implementation of these recommendations that the National Press Club
He did go into bat for Gillian's character, though. There was no distancing or critique whatsoever.
No, but I think it did seem to me as he was doing that, he was just trying to shuffle the actual recommendations off stage right. But
she was his appointment, so he can hardly walk away from that. But I think, as you say, Joe, it was a segmented defence. Let's put it that way. And if you're paying someone $400 and something thousand of the taxpayers' money, and she goes AWOL at key moments over the last 6 months, the public has every right to ask, what are we getting for the money, and what are her performance indicators? Yeah. What are her achievements, and how will we know whether she's been in any way successful in the task that she was set?
What you say, Scott, is so critical, and the question that no one really asks, like, will measures that she has introduced actually decrease anti-Semitism? Because to me, it seems like someone in that position benefits from the continuation of concocting fears around anti-Semitism. It justifies her role. And that's the question that no one's really asking. Do we actually want to address racism? What are the measures of that? You'd think that the measures of success would be a decline in anti-Semitic incidents, but that's something that no one's really asking.
Sorry, Dave, I was just going to say the key question surely is, for her, is what role has Israel's behaviour in Gaza played in the increase in anti-Semitism?
But nobody wants
the key question. It's the only one that never gets asked of her.
It never gets asked at all. And somehow by asking it, you seem to be making yourself vulnerable to attacks of anti-Semitism yourself. Dave?
I don't see how any of us can take it seriously after the neo-Nazi attack on Camp Sovereignty. And she was asked specifically if she would condemn that, and she wouldn't, but then she did give a presentation about how anti-Semitic watermelons are to a room full of people in a fancy hotel in the Gold Coast. I mean, the optics on this are absurd. I don't know why anyone's buying an ounce of this shit.
Well, there's a bit of a conflict of interest as well, potentially. I mean, we know that Advance Australia was involved.
Yeah, that was exactly my point.
In funding those March for Australia rallies, and she's, distanced herself from her husband, and I totally accept that people should not be responsible for the actions of their partners. But that being said, if your partner is funding a rally that has been co-opted and organized by neo-Nazis who are one of the biggest threats to Jewish people, you've got to think that that's a massive conflict of interest. And I think the government is is feeling pretty ashamed at the moment because they've gone and appointed her, likely knowing that information.
I think there's buyer's remorse there. You wouldn't know it necessarily from Burke's comments during the week, but just beneath the surface, I think there's an acknowledgement that this was a terrible mistake. to appoint her, but
and
they just have to
certainly,
own it.
yeah, he was responding to a question, and that the government themselves have not been raising the issue of the report and its recommendations, either hers or indeed the anti-Islamic kind of envoy's report either. It was interesting, though, that over the last couple of weeks we saw yet another episode of censorship by an important cultural and intellectual institution of pro-Palestinian views, with the National Press Club joining the fray. Dave?
Yeah, I guess, can we dub ourselves the new National Press Club yet? Can we claim the title? Yeah. Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, one of the few white Western journalists I still admire after the last few years, was set to talk, no longer is. And so instead, he sat down in my lounge room next to where the rabbit poops and in front of the Lego. And we had a really good chat. We spoke for about an hour, and we're going to show a section of that chat, but also the whole chat will be on the channel, and I'll find out how to link it, and you'll be able to click on something here-ish and watch that. And it was, it was a really, I guess it was a nice moment for me. I do admire this man, but I just want to stress that the sequence of events that got us to this point are actually quite sinister.
Yeah.
Not the sign of a healthy democratic society that someone like that isn't on the television to a very large audience. Keep that in mind as you watch the things he says.
And worth noting that when he was cancelled, or his address was cancelled, the press club lied and said that it had never been confirmed and it was only tentative, and then was forced to sit and watch, as a lot of people posted online, the screenshots from the National Press Club's own website that promoted the talk that apparently had not been confirmed. So let's go to the interview, and we'll come back for more chat afterwards.
Chris Hedges, thank you very much for your time.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
I think I would like to start specific and then broaden out. We should address the fact that you're sitting in my lounge room in front of a bunch of Lego and pot plants and not at the National Press Club of Australia.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at I didn't know anything about them until they canceled me. And you look at the website, and it's one corporate CEO after another. Obviously, the press or journalism is kind of just an afterthought or a branding mechanism. They have three different companies: Thales, BAE, and Amazon, which provides cloud services to the Israeli. All of them provide services to the Israeli military. They had a speaker before me. Obviously, they had blowback. I mean, it's not actually uncommon for those of us who speak out for Palestinian rights to get deplatformed or canceled. It's happened to me many times, but it's pretty egregious coming from a press club. And the other thing is they lied, which, essentially they accused me of lying by saying that they had not posted it on their site. Somebody fortunately took a screenshot of it, which exposed the fact that they had posted it on the site. And then they said that it wasn't confirmed, and we have a confirmation letter. So I don't know why they were so dishonest. I think they would have been a little more astute.
Well, I mean, you would think that, but having watched these people closely for the last few years, maybe that assumption isn't entirely accurate. You were set to give a speech entitled "The Betrayal of Palestinian Journalists by Western Journalists," and having watched the coverage of these people quite closely, I can only assume that they would have felt pangs of shame hearing this address.
I don't think that these people feel any shame at all. It's part of the problem. Remember, I work for the New York Times. There's the self-adulation is kind of off the charts, and they're not particularly introspective or self-critical people, and I come out of that milieu. One would like to think they felt shame, but I think that the whole treatment of Palestinian journalists, and I spent a lot of time in Gaza, and I'm an Arabic speaker, and of course I've lost many friends and colleagues. It's just really grounded in racism. They're not actually looking at the journalistic output by the Palestinians, which is remarkable and courageous and important. They're dismissing them on racial grounds. And you compare, which is what I was going to do in my talk, the coverage of the genocide by my Palestinian colleagues and by my colleagues in the Western press were holed up in hotels in Jerusalem getting background briefings from the Israelis. And the whole point of my talk was, and because I covered many wars, to explain that in a war zone, in an actual conflict, the number of reporters who actually go out is quite tiny. Most of the reporters play at it, and they are essentially tools of the U.S. Embassy, or in the case of the Gulf War, the U.S. military. We call it dog and pony shows. And I don't, the work that I did and is very dangerous, and it requires a certain level of insanity. So I get it why you don't want to be there. I mean, that's a normal reaction. I mean, I volunteered to go into Sarajevo when it was being hit with 300 to 400 shells a day. 45 journalists had been already killed. My photographer was wounded 3 days after I got there. I get that that's not a normal, kind of decision-making process. But what angers me is the people who play at it and pretend, because what they're really doing by disseminating the propaganda, whether that's Israeli propaganda, whether that's US propaganda, is they're discrediting the work of real reporters who take tremendous risks, as my Palestinian colleagues obviously do. There are various numbers, but roughly 240 have been killed, many in targeted assassinations. I mean, there's clear evidence that they were targeted. It wasn't just that they were caught in a bombing raid. So when you compare their work with the work of the Western press that is encamped in Israel, it replicates the experiences that I had in various war zones, where it's a small number of people who go out. And of course, the one class of journalists who do go out are photographers, because you can't fake it. And not only that, that's having been in a lot of combat. Once the shooting starts, I lie down, they stand up. So that was really what I wanted to explain. And then I had examples of how, like, for instance, there was a Reuters team at, I think it was Al Shifa Hospital, and they were filming, and Reuters is very good about giving the coordinates to the IDF, to the Israeli military. So they had given the coordinates. So the Israelis knew they were there, and they killed them because they, part of it is trying to shut down any coverage of the genocide. And then the Israelis said that it was a Hamas camera. You can't make this stuff up. Well, which is absurd. It was a Reuters camera. I mean, as Reuters said. But I had listed in the talk all the headlines, and or they accused a journalist who was assassinated of being a Hamas militant who oversaw rocket attacks. And it's that knee-jerk repetition of Israeli lies that really inhibits the work of those of us who are on the ground. Because I was in Gaza. When I was in Gaza, I was bombed by the Israeli military. I was in ambushes. I mean, there was at Netzarim Junction, a kid got killed. A young kid got killed a few feet away from me, and we kind of carried his body up the road. I mean, and it was a constant battle to transmit those truths from places like Gaza or other conflicts I covered. And it wasn't just the state, whether the United States or whether it's Israel, who sought to discredit our reporting, but also so many of our own colleagues. And that's what I really wanted to focus on at the press club, that we're in essence, by repeating these lies. And let's be clear, most of the journalists know their lies. We know their lies, but it's, especially if you work as I did for a major media publication like the New York Times, it's all about access. Your editors care about access. They don't really care about truth. They want access. And a New York Times reporter, like any of these elite reporting outlets, they're very, very good careerists. I mean, they know what's good for their career. There's a kind of cynicism about it.
They sound like politicians.
Well, they're careerists, yeah. I mean, politicians are even more depraved, usually, in the sense that politicians need constant adulation and reaffirmation, even the good ones. I mean, I had to report on a lot of them. but journalists get, and that you're right, in a sense, like politicians, they love being in the circle of power. They were all they'd all get gaga over, their little going out and playing soldier for a day in the Humvee, and they put them in a little uniform, and it was all ridiculous. Um, but we've really, really betrayed our Palestinian colleagues who paid a tremendous price for doing the job, for doing their job.
By about the middle of October 2023, Israel had told us they were going to commit genocide, and they had started in earnest, and the footage was coming home. You didn't need to be the type of person that makes questionable decisions to arrive into war zones to see this firsthand.
Yeah,
the Palestinian journalists were providing primary source information, reels of it that we could see on Instagram. And then as the next 2 years unfolded, those journalists in Palestine got murdered by Israel at about a rate of every second day, while people wearing suits on the television took it upon their job to gaslight Australia that there wasn't a genocide occurring. Why did they impulsively feel that that was their role when the truth was so obviously presented and out there?
Well, because the role of mainstream journalism is to essentially buttress the power structure. And if they don't buttress or repeat the dominant narrative, then the power structure shuts them out. And the people who run these organizations see that as fatal. I mean, although I worked for the New York Times, I never worked Washington. I never covered the State Department. I was always in war zones. When I was hired by the Times, I was already in the Middle East, and I'd already spent 5 years covering the war in El Salvador, and I'd already spent 2 years in the Middle East. And the thing about these news organizations is that if you want war coverage, you need people who have that peculiar DNA of being willing to risk their lives to go in and do it. And there's a very dark side to what we do. I don't want to pretend that, we're kind of saints, we're adrenaline junkies, and there's a very hyper masculine culture to it and all, which I write about in my book, War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning. But you need them. The problem is that kind of those characteristics don't fit into especially a corporate newsroom, because what you're doing is hiring people who are not only defying authority, but defying authority that's trying to kill them. And when you get back to the very kind of Tony snob-ridden structure of the New York Times, that personality type, I'm speaking of myself, but you don't ever re-enter those spaces. But newspapers need them, because you need a few of them anyway. Peter Arnett is from New Zealand, right, Peter? I think maybe. Anyway, maybe. I don't want to mix up New Zealand and Australia. I'll get lynched.
You wouldn't be the first American to do so.
I know, I probably wouldn't. I think he might be from New Zealand. He's a friend of mine.
You talked a little bit about not being able to go back. I think lots of people feel that way in terms of political awakenings that they've experienced since the Gaza genocide started in earnest. It's laid bare how complicit Western society is on this project. We've seen things like your cancellation. We've seen Yanis Varoufakis cancelled from speaking. He was from speaking at the State Library Victoria.
Oh, wow.
Antoinette Lattouf lost her job at the ABC. And then there's the existence of people like myself and Joel that just have to work outside this system because of our beliefs. In a column you wrote about the last days of Gaza, you said there would be people that you never talk to again over this.
Yes.
I felt that in my bones. Having watched 240 journalists get murdered and no one in the mainstream seemingly caring, could you just extrapolate on that sentiment a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, so, I've been very fierce since the genocide began. And I'm friends with a very fine, he's Israeli actually, historian. His name is Ross Siegel, and he's a genocide Holocaust scholar. And I think 2 weeks after October 7th, he called it a genocide and called it out for what it is. And his argument was, I'm a genocide scholar. The whole point of teaching genocide studies or Holocaust studies, and by the way, he's the exception. Almost nearly all Holocaust scholars have refused to, which has created another problem, as well as all the institutions that are designed to commemorate the Holocaust. None of them have spoken out against the genocide. But he said, my job is to recognize all the signs and call it out. Well, of course, that's why one should study the Holocaust. It's why people should study genocides. Well, he had been given a job to run the Holocaust Studies Centers at the University of Minnesota. That got immediately canceled. He and I testified at the State House in New Jersey. We both live in New Jersey, about the IHRA. This is the bill that I think 36 states have now passed. Institutions like Harvard, Columbia have adopted, that essentially it equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
We have the same push.
You have the same crap here. Well, it's insane. And first of all, the Zionists packed the lobby and they were jeering and yelling, and they cut his mic off and they cut my mic. The chairman committee cut our mics. It's on YouTube. They cut our mics off. And it was kind of, there was a kind of, strange irony there, in that we were testifying that this would shut down free speech, and it shut down free speech. So it kind of illustrated our point. But yeah, it was, so I covered the Middle East for 7 years. I'm an Arabic speaker. If you understand the Zionist project, you know what its goals are. It has, since its inception, attempted to displace Palestinians and steal their land. Huge displacements, ethnic cleansing, as well as massacres. In 1948, 750,000 Palestinians pushed out, many of them to Gaza. And then the 1967 wars, another 350,000 were ethnically cleansed or displaced. And so those were big displacements. But in between, it was a slow motion ethnic cleansing. I covered Oslo, and when I covered Oslo, I think there were about 200,000 Jewish colonists in the West Bank. There's now over 700,000. At this point, Israel controls 80% of the West Bank. It focuses not on the West Bank, but it's all one project. And October 7th gave Israel the opportunity it was looking for, or the excuse it was looking for, to destroy Gaza and drive the Palestinians out. They have struggled to find a place where the Palestinians can end up. Egypt, and I've been quite a bit in the Middle East actually since October 7th. So I do a lot of work for Al Jazeera. I will not only do broadcasts here, but they've flown me twice to Qatar. So I'll do Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English. I've been in Egypt 3 different times. I was in Jordan last summer and the West Bank. So I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East since October 7th. So yeah, if you understand the history, if you understand the nature of Israeli policies and the ideology of Zionism, then you know where it's going. But to get up and say that, there's a huge cost. And you've had Australian journalist Mary Costacoulis, and others. But let me tell you, these are real journalists, the real journalists, because our job as journalists, I find the cynicism within journalism quite disturbing, in the name of objectivity or the name of balance, especially broadcast journalism, where they'll just, in our country, they'll put one line Democrat and one line Republican. Well, the presenter knows they're both lying. But they've broken that contract with the viewer, or the contract. I'm primarily a writer, although I do broadcast stuff. But we've broken that contract, which is to help them understand the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So in the press club, going back to the National Press Club of Australia, because I'm a reporter, I heard from sources that they'd reached out to the Israeli ambassador, former lieutenant colonel in the IDF, not to replace me. The press club was very kind of tricky about how they responded. I never said that he was replacing me. They reached out for him to talk, which is true. And I said, and I wrote a column, and I'm giving a talk tonight that'll, I think, deal with this. I mean, balance is good but you don't balance truth with lies. So he, as a lieutenant colonel in the IDF, could explain all sorts of things that I know, but from the outside, like how Israel uses AI for targeting, what the ratio of acceptable civilian casualties. I think it's 20 if you kill a Hamas fighter, and it's hundreds if you're targeting a Hamas commander. This is all part of the rules of engagement. And so if he wanted to tell us, he knows more than I do, obviously, about it, but he isn't. I went back and looked, and he's spewing garbage and lies, just like all the other Israeli ambassadors and diplomats, about beheaded babies and sexual assault and human shields. I mean, the irony is that it's the Israelis who regularly use Palestinians as human shields. They will dress them up in Israeli uniforms and then usually often handcuff them or bind their hands and then force them to go ahead of Israeli units into tunnels and into houses where they're potentially booby trapped. That's very common. So if you had real balance, then you would have somebody from inside the system, because I as a reporter was on the receiving end of Israeli airstrikes and sniper fire and everything else. You would have somebody, and that you would balance it. You would have a balance of truth with truth. You would kind of complete the circle.
Mm-hmm.
That's good journalism.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, good journalism is, kind of going the way of the dinosaur.
Well, that was quite the takedown of, a whole lot of organisations and institutions, starting with the National Press Club, but then kind of working through the media more generally and their betrayal of their Palestinian colleagues. That must have been a difficult interview, Dave, to hear him so baldly just set out really how the journalists from their hotel rooms in Jerusalem are hanging out their Palestinian colleagues to dry.
Well, in some ways it was difficult, but in some ways when you hear someone speaking the truth as you perceive it and you haven't heard much of that because you're being gaslit the whole time, it's actually somewhat grounding and reassuring. And that is, again, just the first third of the interview that we did. So I do encourage everyone to click on that, because Chris is the type of person that more people in Australia should be hearing from. We are deprived of these sorts of voices in our mainstream spaces for very good reasons. But, I mean, speaking personally, I've been reporting on this for 2 years, and the process is, unlike Chris, I'm not in Gaza, so I need to speak with Palestinian journalists. And, I alluded to this. They just kept getting murdered over the course of the 2 years. And it's deeply traumatic. It's heartbreaking. And it's compounded by the rage that you feel when you put the television on and they lie to you about it. It's untenable. And I mean, I'm actually... Joe, take it.
Yeah. Well, look, I think I do encourage everyone to watch that full interview as well. I think what has been, look, we have a ceasefire, and that is no small thing given what has taken place in Gaza over the last 2 years. Palestinian people returning to their homes are facing just complete destruction on the ground. And we've also seen some very disturbing images coming out of Gaza City in particular, of Hamas seeking to impose their own discipline. And we've seen footage of public executions of rival clans, military clans or militarized clans, who are potential threats to Hamas.
We should point out that these rival clans on the ground are being armed and funded by the IDF and the Israeli government to create civil disobedience for Western media to report on.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not familiar with that detail. I mean, what the comment I was going to make and throw to you to respond to, Scott, was, I mean, for the peace to hold, Israel has to agree for it to hold every step of the way. And one of the core conditions is that Hamas not only has no leadership role in the governance structures, the future governance structures of Gaza, but that they agree to disarm. And everything that we're seeing through footage like that seems to suggest they have no intention of disarming, which just puts this sort of air of volatility and uncertainty over the reality on the ground for the returning Palestinian civilians.
Yes, look, the easy part was phase one, the exchange of prisoners. In many ways, that was the most straightforward aspect of the entire plan, the 20-point plan, and that was something that both sides were prepared to agree to under pressure on both sides, which makes a mockery of this idea that Hamas is holding on to dead Israelis and refusing to return them, because there's absolutely no reason why they'd do that. There's nothing to gain from it. But the test comes from now on, and that is, how do you implement a plan for Gaza after the conflict, which hasn't been authored by any Palestinians, which doesn't address the issue of Palestinian self-determination, which stays clear of the notion of a Palestinian state, which we know one side is fundamentally opposed to in every respect. How will that work? The disarmament issue is another one. At the moment, I think Trump is happy for Hamas to remain in control of that part of Gaza, because take the guns away and you've got this problem of total anarchy. You've got no system of law or control or order at all. So he's prepared to wear that for a while. But the absence of detail in the 20-point plan doesn't tell us, therefore, how we're going to transition from where we are now to a future territory which is administered by Palestinians, again, with Palestinians being told by others that who will be able to be eligible to administer their affairs and who won't be. In other words, outsiders saying, well, self-determination will be determined by us, not by you. So that's a major problem, of course. It also belies the fact that Hamas is still a major player in the drama in terms of the support that it presumably still has amongst significant numbers of Palestinians in Gaza, and the absence of an alternative organised political authority. It reminds me a bit of post-Mubarak Egypt, when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, because they were the only group who were organised to contest an election, which they ultimately won, but which was ultimately stolen away from them by the military shortly after. And they were underground, organising, keeping themselves organised and ready for that opportunity. In the case of Gaza, you take Hamas out of the equation, the Palestinian Authority itself has very little, if any, support or presence within Gaza. And the other Islamic jihadi factions and other resistance factions are pretty much on the same page as Hamas. So take Hamas out, who fills the vacuum? And of course, this is why most people are assuming that Israel will take advantage of that vacuum and fill it to extend Gaza into Greater Israel, because they're not prepared to cede that independence that is the right of all Palestinians to self-determination. And they're not going to, they want to honour the commitments that they made, which was their preference is ethnic cleansing of the entire strip for the extension of Israeli settlements throughout Gaza. That's their intention. They've been open about it. There's no contradiction. There's no ambiguity there. And that's why we've achieved the first but easiest stage of following a ceasefire, but now it gets hard.
Sarah, I heard you speak at a rally on the weekend, very beautifully, by the way, and Actually, everyone's speaking there. The theme was basically that a ceasefire is not justice, nor is it peace. This is a continuation of the occupation. What's your take, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, on what Scott was saying, this is in so many ways a repetition of history. We know that Israel and Netanyahu himself has a history of backing Hamas because of wanting to create that sort of civil unrest and wanting to create a situation which will justify further intervention and expulsion. You know, at the end of the day, the reality of the situation is that we have Israel controlling an entire territory of which Jewish people, Jewish Israelis, are not the majority. And that's the critical point here. In order for Israel to maintain its legitimacy as a state, it has to, in some way, population control Palestinians. And it's doing that to the extent that it can. You know, we have Palestinians in the West Bank, this expansion of settlements in unprecedented levels, which is receiving very little international attention. And then we have this plan in Gaza where the plan is maybe to input the corrupt PA into Gaza, a non-elected government, and without any Palestinian self-determination or control. And it leaves Palestinians with a complete lack of freedom and self-determination. And we already know what a lack of freedom and a lack of self-determination leads to. People don't just accept these conditions of occupation for decades and decades. Palestinians have, throughout history, always resisted against their oppression. And so we are going to see a continuation, I think, of violence and a continuation of Palestinian suffering first and foremost if we maintain this sort of situation. But, and Palestinians are the ones that are going to suffer the most out of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, of Gaza. The Knesset passed a motion only recently saying that they wanted to have a Jewish majority in the West Bank. They're being very explicit. Netanyahu, in the midst of the ceasefire, was telling Israeli media in Hebrew that Israel's not going to withdraw from Gaza. There doesn't seem to be any actual intention to withdraw. And what that means is that Palestinians are going to suffer. There is going to be this continued attempt to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. But I think it also means that Jewish Israelis are going to suffer. Because at the end of the day, history shows us you can't have peace and you can't have safety if the people that you are locking out are unfree and if your safety comes at their expense.
Everything you said, Sarah, I agree entirely. The other thing I want to point out is that I'm increasingly concerned that the talk of a ceasefire is a Western establishment narrative pivot as much as it's anything else. Because what I'm starting to notice is that people that are still protesting because the occupation hasn't ended are being positioned in mainstream press as they're the disturbance to the peace now. We have peace now. Why are you still in the streets causing a rubble kind of thing?
But, I mean, to be fair, there is a ceasefire, shaky as it is, holding on the ground. So the bombs are not falling in the way that they were. And I
They're
think
still falling.
They're not falling in the way that they were. And I think that's important to acknowledge, even as I absolutely agree that the pathway forward, that phase 2 seems to be completely opaque. And there was an interview on The Atlantic actually with a lawyer and a former advisor of the PLO, Diane Buttu, who was talking about how the West seemed to think that, like, acknowledging and recognizing a two-state, the Palestinian state, and calling for a two-state solution seems to be this magic pill. So now that we've recognized Palestine, what does that mean? We're recognizing a pile of rubble. What is the state that we're recognizing, and how is it going to be empowered when we still have, as you say, Sarah, Israel saying, we don't recognize a two-state solution, and we're still expanding our settlements in the West Bank, and we're still maintaining our occupation of Gaza. So what exactly is being recognised, and how is that proactively assisting to find a long-term peace?
I'll
this
give you a
is
quick, sorry, I was going to say, I'll give you a quick
Oh, then,
example.
Sarah. Yeah.
The reason, in short, is because the recognition of Palestine has almost nothing to do with Gaza. This is an attempt to salvage a long-standing policy across the Western world, with the exception of the United States, for a two-state solution, right? Putting aside the details of where that is and what it is. If they were not to recognize Palestine at this point in time, they would be undermining 40 years of their own policies, which is essentially about the West Bank. It's not really anything much about Gaza at all, as far as the Western governments are concerned. So the reason for the timing was not only the pressure of public opinion, domestic public opinion in Western Europe and in Australia and elsewhere. It's because if they didn't draw the line then, at that point, the entire premise of Western policy towards Israel-Palestine, which is a two-state solution, would vaporize before their very eyes. So they literally had to say it now, regardless of the fact that Israel has no intentions of acknowledging a two-state. Neither does the United States, and it's not mentioned in Trump's 20-point plan. But if they don't do that now, their policy is they're undermining their own policy. It's not that they care about Palestinians. They don't care about whether a Palestinian, state ultimately emerges with Gaza as a part of it. They're concerned about the fact that their entire premise of their 40 years of policy would just vaporize before their very eyes if they didn't do it.
But if they're not going to undermine their own policy, then at some point, I mean, this goes to the lie at the heart of it, I guess, which is Scott's point, Sarah, is that they will actually have to confront Israel as being the obstacle to it. And they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to have arms embargoes. They're not willing to have trade sanctions. They're not willing to cut off any form of trade or to oust Israel from the international arenas, which logic would suggest they should be now doing.
And this is kind of, I guess this is one of the things about recognition that in a way doesn't get them out of the bind. In some ways, as Scott says, this was in some ways a pressure valve, a way to sort of respond to mounting global pressure in response to Israel's actions. But at the end of the day, we now have a number of Western countries, including Australia, recognizing a country as state that is entirely occupied, where the people of that state have no self-determination. The one thing that really strikes me from Trump's plan, supposed peace plan, is that, unlike in other situations where there has been, Western control and Western influence, at least there is this sort of facade or semblance of a democratic, a falsified election. But in this case, Palestinians don't even get that. And so we have now a situation in which Australia has recognised a state that it has to concede is entirely under another state's, Israel's, occupation. And Israel is the blocker to that. And I think that says something that provides more avenues for Australia, for people to pressure Australia to actually take that recognition responsibly. And of course, that what does that do to people on the ground in Gaza? I think that's an open question. And of course, as Scott said, this is being used as sort of this way to sort of salvage the dead two-state solution. But in many ways, it's also, this really critical point that it has to now concede. Australia now has to concede and grapple with the fact that it's dealing with this real aberration under international law, a state that is entirely occupied.
Look, we're going to have to wind up there for today. But before we do, I did just want to ask Sarah, you wrote a beautiful piece for The Guardian on really the impact that this traumatic time has had. Obviously, it had the impact mostly on the Palestinian people, but Jewish communities have been torn asunder, and we've watched that play out. And you spoke wrote beautifully about the profound impact that has had on you and your community. And I wonder if you could just reflect on that a little bit for us to conclude.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Joe, the Palestinians are the people that have been subjected to a genocide, and I'm in no way claiming that what Jewish people have experienced is in any way comparable. But the reality is that this genocide has torn apart so many Jewish communities and Jewish families. Since launching the Jewish Council, I think probably one of the most frequent emails that I get from Jewish people is asking for advice about how do we speak to our families, how do we speak to our loved ones, how do we speak to our communities, how do we speak to our rabbis at our synagogues. What do we do? Because a lot of the legacy Jewish organizations have backed Israel, and have backed Israel to the very end, have backed Netanyahu, have backed Trump. We have seen and watched those communal institutions, which were once homes for us and once, taught us what it was to be Jewish, now backing something which goes against, all of my core values and the values in which so many of us were taught. And so many of us are sort of the descendants of the histories of the Holocaust. And that has had a really profound impact of so many Jewish people of my generations, of older generations. But we have to grapple with the fact that, the descendants that in many cases, the descendants of this grave genocide have now, their institutions have now gone on to back another genocide. And that has really profound consequences. I don't know what will happen to Jewish communities, but in many ways, so many of us are thinking about how do we build new Jewish institutions, because there are so many Jewish people who are opposed to what Israel is doing. And there are so many Jewish people every single day who are changing their minds. And I still have, I'm not shutting the door on anyone. It's been an incredibly painful period, I think, for anyone who's spoken out against this genocide, not just Jewish people, but so many of us have lost relationships and have had personal losses. But it's really important for us, I think, to rebuild these alternative institutions and spaces which are for which serve our fundamental values, because we have been so betrayed by our institutions, not just Jewish institutions, but I think we've been betrayed by so many public institutions in this moment.
I think you're right, and your work has been both courageous and inspiring, and we non-Jewish people thank you for it. That is the end. Before we go, as ever, I will ask our panellists if they have any top tips that they'd like to raise, anything from the week just gone or coming up that you've got your eye on, Scott?
Well, I'm fascinated by how Israel is going to rehabilitate its reputation. The process has begun in the sense that the ceasefire is being portrayed as a line drawn under what's happened over the last 2 years, and there's been pressure from Trump and others to forgive Netanyahu for whatever he may have committed domestically in Israel on corruption charges, as well as the ICC indictment and others. So I'm fascinated to see how questions like reparations and the rehabilitation of Israel's international reputation, so Israelis can travel without restriction, where they're not investigated for their role in the IDF deployed to Gaza, how they're going to grapple with that, and how Western governments like Australia will respond. Is it going to be forgive and forget for the governments? It won't be for the populations, but how are governments going to move over the next 12 months in particular, if the ceasefire holds, how are they going to move to bring to account those responsible for what's happened, or will a line be drawn as Israel wants, and we're back to business as usual?
It's interesting that there is no discussion at the moment of Israel paying reparations for all the damage it caused. It's going to be a massive multi-billion-dollar project to rebuild Gaza. Who will pay? Dave, your top tip.
I just wanted to. It's probably superfluous to recommend the number one politics podcast in the country, but I'm going to do it anyway. I was listening to We Used to Be Journos the other day, and they were very kind about our show, and they shouted it out. And this isn't sycophancy. They do actually have a really great show. Jan and Antoinette do really good critique of language in media, and I think that's just a crucial skill moving into the world that we are. So yeah, just shout out to Et Media for being awesome. That, like, two powerful Australian women with background in the Levant, they're exactly the type of people that white Australia should hear more from.
Indeed. Sarah, top tip from you.
I guess as ever, I'm worried constantly about the rise of the far right and fascism, and I think what I am watching and scared and interested in as well is Israel's relationship to the far right and to fascism, and how far that will go before they realise they're in bed with neo-Nazis. And I saw today and just confirmed it, a video that Jordan Vanderlam posted, and that I just went onto the Israeli minister, the Israeli body for the diaspora, which releases frequently these lists of pro-Palestine events and anti-Israel activism and what it calls sort of delegitimization. And it's released a list of this upcoming week's anti-Israel rallies, and it has listed the rally that is the anti-fascist rally against the March for Australia rally, which, as we know, was co-opted and is being led by neo-Nazis and far-right extremists who have a tendency of hating Jewish people. And it is listed, that rally, as an anti-Israel rally, in the same wake that Israel's Minister for Diaspora Affairs has rolled out the red carpet for fascist demagogue Tommy Robinson. So I think I'm shocked, appalled, but also, I think there's some admissions in there about where Israel is headed. But I think the real question is, how far will it go in siding with white supremacists and neo-Nazis?
That is kind of incredible. My last little quick top tip is just keep an eye, as ever, what's going on in the US, and the highly politicised Department of Justice indictments have just been made and charges laid against John Bolton. So that's the third of the high-profile political opponents of Donald Trump that he has managed to get the Department of Justice now to basically press charges against for the crime of being opposed to Trump. And ironically, Bolton has been charged with the very many charges that Donald Trump clearly had committed in terms of holding on and misuse of classified information. So
every accusation is a confession with narcissists and fascists.
It is absolutely true. This one is a really extreme and stark example of that. So thank you all for watching today. Particular thanks to Scott and Sarah for joining us, and Chris in absentia. Don't forget to watch that full interview. And if you can, as ever, chuck a few dollars our way so that we can keep paying the hard costs that we confront to keep the Sunday Shot on air. We look forward to seeing you next week.